AJ here with something which is more of a random train of thought piece than is normal. But this has been floating around the brain pan for a while, and an old online discussion thread got me thinking even more on it. To that end, it's relatively common in the community to ponder what the Iron Kingdoms or Imoran might look like if adapted into a new video game. As you may know, or may not, let's be fair, some may well argue ignorance is bliss in this context. War Machine managed to get a toe into the video game market back in 2014 when, in the lead-up to Mark II expansion Vengeance, the game War Machine Tactics was produced. That was right around the time I started playing War Machine, the tabletop game, so I didn't really become aware of Tactics until some time later. Unfortunately for the uninitiated, War Machine Tactics received a rather mixed response, and while updates improved it, with new operating systems rolling out, I understand it's almost impossible to play it on some newer machines. Tactics was perennially plagued with bugs, flawed gameplay, and an extremely rough around the edges presentation, before eventually becoming antiquated in feel once Mark III hit tables. It also went through a fair bit of iteration, and the original announcement trailers made it look like a third-person action game, and not the XCOM-like which was released. Well over 10 years on, and social media being social media, one idea or another of War Machine being adapted into a video game pops up once every so often. And most tend to be divided into two broad genres. The first is strategy, whether RTS a la Dawn of War, or the combined RTT-TPS archetype of the Total War series. And the second is something action-adventure oriented, most commonly as an RPG. Which is understandable given how the whole Iron Kingdoms IP stemmed from a tabletop RPG setting. I'm still in two minds as to what sort of strategy game I'd like for the setting, but with respect to RPGs, I will spitball as follows. Ever since I read the Quickshot 1AR, Synthesis of Rebellion, I really wanted to have an RPG set during the last years of the rebellion against the Orgoth by the Iron Alliance, with an initial setup similar in presentation to 1AR. Sort of like the dungeon or prisoner levels which form prologues or introductions to games such as Dishonored, Elder Scrolls Oblivion and Skyrim, and so on and so forth. With Mark IV here bringing in Orgoth as a playable faction, this strikes me as an increasingly good idea, creatively that is. To explain, for those who didn't read the No Quarter issue which 1AR was published in, or have understandably not remembered it, the Synthesis of Rebellion was a quick-shot IKRPG scenario published in issue 60 of No Quarter magazine back in May 2015, and it tells the story of a jailbreak by the player characters as they escape their imprisonment by the still firmly entrenched Orgoth overlords. Split into 5 scenes, the party are interrogated by their captors and escape by means of sleight of hand or distraction. They spend the next couple of scenes making their way out of the labyrinthine Orgoth fortress before finally getting to breathe fresh air again and, naturally running for their lives, for lack of a better way of putting it, to evade a pretty thorough pursuit by Orgoth warriors and war witches, led by the scenario's primary antagonist, one Captain Ryark, or however you pronounce that name. This is one of the very few pieces of playable narrative content set during the Orgoth occupation era, and one which I would think would be perfect to explore further. Perfect because there are enough events in the world to establish driving motivation for a potential player character, and also because of how little in-depth detail there is for each event, as well as mentions of more local matters. Granted, this is to be expected since everything to do with the Orgoth invasion, occupation and rebellion only serve as setup for the modern era, which forms the real, in inverted commas, real background, timeline and events for both IKRPG and War Machine and Hordes. As such, the period spanning 600 BR to 200 AR was not written to be a setting in its own right, but because it is well populated with dates and events which are nonetheless important to the world's inhabitants, along with a healthy, shall we say, number of historical figures, there is a lot of fertile, creative ground which can be capitalised upon. Because of this, a game's writers would have a lot of freedom to establish trends, conventions and traditions within the setting which are particular to the time we're considering, which is roughly 175-ish to 200 AR. This is especially the case for the Orgoth, about whose culture we still know relatively precious little, even with the start of War Machine Mark IV. And there is a lot of exploring which can be done by expanding upon how and why they did what they did during the occupation era, along with the more day-to-day of said what and why. Overall, I believe this would be a very welcome information dump for all of us lorehounds. However, this also extends to pre-Iron Kingdoms Tordorans, Caspians, Cards, Freyn, and even Cholkin, Rulik, and Iosans. Because of this, the costume design would be a little different from what we're accustomed to, but still very familiar. What follows isn't entirely story-related as such. An RPG can succeed with a variety of known and popular gameplay mechanics. Narratively, the player starts as a prisoner about to be interrogated and or tortured, or perhaps simply executed, by the Orgoth, and some plot device or other lets you spring a jailbreak. Cue character creator, with full IKRPG variety in terms of race, stats, and abilities. However, this might strike one as being a bit too Elder Scrollsy, even if it works. That said, another option I'm warming to is being a mercenary in service to Elias Declan, when he's making his way from Serral to Caspia, and the opening tutorial mission is fending off Orgoth's attention while on the way. Alternatively, we can combine the two, and the player gets captured during the escort mission, and the first proper mission is the escape, with the game world opening up outside an Orgoth fortress with Caspia in the distance, or something along those lines. After finishing the tutorial level, whether it's a dungeon escape or escort mission or whatever, the game world itself can be progressively opened up and be broadly hub-based, with a small number of moderately sized sandboxes linked by fast travel points in the style of Assassin's Creed 2 or something like that. This is because the sheer breadth of locations to which the main story will go, which will make a true open world impractical and perhaps even undesirable due to the size of the setting and our natural wish to be able to overlay an existing map of the Iron Kingdoms and gleefully point out where everything is or should be. For example, places which would hold major elements of the game's plot could include a number of known cities, starting with Caspia and the surrounding areas, to serve as the player character's base alongside their allies, whether in a player party system or companion system or something else. Other locales could be Cardoff, Five Fingers, Dreherin, well, your mileage may vary, and a large open-ish patch consisting of the region in and around Point Bourne, including the Nars, which allows inclusion of the Cholkin, and the Thornwood, which allows inclusion of the Druids, maybe extending to Tana for a bit more Tordoran involvement. The last one which comes to mind is a similar area which links Lael, Rule and Ios to act as a junction sandbox, which can fill a few cultural racial gaps which aren't that relevant to the main plot. Major plot points can be modified with certain missions being based on national or racial motivations. For example, humans can face a quandary with respect to the betrayal of the Card Colossal construction, alleged betrayal of the Card Colossal construction, with perspectives both Cardic and Caspian. On a related note, religion could be played into with the ease or difficulty with which Morrowans and Mennonites cooperate, perhaps even hinting at Caspian Mennonite dreams of secession. Elsewhere, Dwarven and Ogren players can venture north to try securing aid from Rule. On the other hand, elves can go the Mage Hunter route and be tasked with smuggling Cortex plants into Ios, while on the other, they can go the Seeker route and be out looking for clues about the Divine Court. Also, Cholkin can confront or side with nationalistic leaders, Horlock, Doomshaper's forerunners, basically, in efforts which either forestall or hasten the worsening of human-Cholkin relations, ultimately leading to the Cholkin Wars. I don't think any of this is mutually exclusive, so these more personal quests can complement an overarching story which centres around the player character's contribution to defeating the Orgoth, up to and including, should they so choose, acting as a mercenary to a Crixian pirate commander and fighting amidst or observing the Scourge. But of course, plot armour means they discover it beforehand and hot-tail it out of there just in time. This overall narrative path can even be branched based on player choice, order, in inverted commas, building the Colossals, testing the Cortex, or Chaos, helping the Druids of the Circle Orboros formulate the Riplung Plague, or even both if they play within a relatively narrow range of routes. Perhaps that might even be a solidly neutral path, which sends the player along a more reactive course, in which they're swept up in the rising conflict, and while they still contribute, it's not so impactful in terms of world history. As to the Orgoth, naturally they would serve as the main antagonists, with the occasional in-Reese collaborator in Crixian. I'd personally love it if a Lich Lord was one of the late-game bosses, but might be taken as a bit silly. So on that note, because of the setting and known lore about the time in Crixian history, it would be an opportunity to look further into the past of the Lich Lords, Fulminous and Tenebrous in particular. Concerning more realistic choices for bosses, an ongoing regular mini-boss could be an Orgoth military commander found at outposts across the game world, with a handful of actual bosses being the regional governors. The final battle on the mainland would be filled with colossals, and depending on the PC's skill set, they could be controlling one of them. You can't deny that the idea of controlling a colossal over the shoulder is a very cool one. Alternatively, the player could be tasked with infiltrating the headquarters of the last senior governors for a set-piece boss fight, who escapes up to set up the Scourge. The fight on Dredge occurring would be such that you finally catch up to the aforementioned senior governor and get one last showdown, with the act ending when the Orgoth War Witches press their suicide button, with the PC escaping in cinematic fashion. The game would then end with signing the Corvus Treaties, and depending on the character's race and gameplay decisions, it could presage certain coming events: the Colossal Wars, Rise of the Retribution of Sara, the Chalkin Wars, rules involving in Iron Kingdom's mercenary affairs. You get the idea. So these are my rough thoughts on what IKRPG as a video game could look like, one which I'd happily launch myself into multiple concurrent campaigns, first one as an elf, surprise, surprise. And as is usual to what follows such presentations, the obligatory questions. So what do you think of this brief take? Got any ideas that you might want to add or change? What did your ideal RPG or action-adventure set in the Iron Kingdoms look like? Similar? Completely different? Please share. And if you want an Iron Kingdoms or a modern video game which isn't an RPG, what would that be instead? And what would its core gameplay and narrative elements be? I look forward to your comments.